Yes.
So before I start with today's business, an issue came up yesterday afternoon during Ms Fraser Butlin's presentation in relation to the concept of non-specific testing. And I'm being provided with some further information about that, and it's something I may come back to tomorrow. In terms of the business for the rest of this week, we are looking first at Professor John Cash and his role and decisions and actions, and then the role of Dr Harold Gunson. They occupied broadly equivalent positions in respectively Scotland and England and Wales. And we've thought that talking about their views, often expressed in quite trenchant terms, their decisions, roles and actions and responsibilities would be a useful introduction to a number of issues which we'll then be exploring over the coming weeks with witnesses who are giving evidence orally. It won't surprise you to know there's a vast amount of documentation in relation to each of them. And so the written presentations are inevitably selective. The oral presentation will inevitably be more selective still, and no particular significance should be attached to the selection of documents. There are really three purposes in drawing attention to material relating to Professor Cash. The first is to show you and those listening his views on a number of issues relevant to the inquiry's terms of reference. And it's important to emphasise that by showing you his views, we are not to be taken to be suggesting that those views are either correct or incorrect. Those are matters which may be appropriate for submissions at a later stage on behalf of core participants. But that's the first purpose. The second is to help understand what his role was and the part he played in certain important decisions and actions relevant to the blood services. And then the third is, as I've already indicated, to serve as an introduction to some of the key issues that we'll be exploring over the coming weeks. So, for example, either this afternoon or tomorrow morning, we'll look at a number of documents relevant to the question of the introduction of screening or testing for hepatitis C, which we know was not introduced until the autumn of 1991, save in one regional transfusion centre area. And we'll look at what Professor Cash said about that, his role in the decision-making process. But that will very much be as an introduction to the issue, which we'll explore with a number of key players, such as Professor Contreras and others, when they give their oral evidence. Just to start then with a brief overview of Professor Cash and his employment responsibilities. He was a consultant at the Edinburgh and South East Scotland Blood Transfusion Service from 1971 to 1979, and he was appointed as director of that service in 1974. In 1979, he became the National Medical Director for the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service, and his role changed, in terms of its description at least, to National Medical and Scientific Director in, I think, 1988. And according to his CV, which we have amongst the papers that we've disclosed, he retired in 1997. Now, we'll obviously be hearing a lot, not least from oral witnesses over the coming hearings about the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service. But there's a useful snapshot of it as at 1988. If we look at NHBT 302934, it's the annual report from 1988 to 1989. If we go to the next page, we'll see a number of the leading individuals within the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service. So we have National Medical Director Professor Cash, and then we have there listed the directors of the various transfusion centres within Scotland set out. And then towards the bottom we see Director Protein Fractionation Centre, Dr Perry. I will obviously be touching on the activities of the Protein Fractionation Centre today and tomorrow morning, but that again is an issue that we'll be coming back to in substantially more detail when we look at both PFC and BPL in our hearings in March of next year. And then if we go to the next page, just to see what the service was that Professor Cash was director of, we look at the third paragraph. We can see there the description of the 7 operational units making up the SNBTS, the 5 regional transfusion centres, Aberdeen, Dundee, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Inverness, the Protein Fractionation Centre and the headquarters unit in Edinburgh. And then if we look at the bottom paragraph, we see responsibility for the operational management of those aspects of the service which are national in character primarily rests with the centre directors, who meet with the National Medical Director, so that's Professor Cash, at regular intervals to plan future strategies and monitor performance. We can take that down, thank you. So Professor Cash was a member of multiple committees, working groups, societies and organisations during his career with the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service. I'm just going to mention some of them which are of more importance than others to the inquiry's investigative work. So he was appointed to the Medical Research Council's subcommittee on hepatitis in 1970. From 1980 to 1982, he was a member of the Medical Research Council's Committee on Blood Transfusion. If we just look at PRSE 00002836, this is one of the many statements that Professor Cash gave to the Penrose inquiry. I think at my last count there are 16 witness statements because of the way in which the Penrose inquiry took its statements, which was to ask for statements on specific issues or sub-issues rather than one overarching statement. I will refer to a handful of those in the course of the presentation, and also to some of his oral evidence to the Penrose inquiry, which we'll probably get to tomorrow. But this is one of his statements to the Penrose inquiry. And if we just go to the bottom of the second page, he makes an observation about the committee I just referred to at the bottom of the page. He says, I recall that SHHD, so Scottish Home and Health Department officials, showed little interest in this work. And then he says this, and how dismayed, astonished and alarmed we were. Just go to the top of the next page. When, without any consultation of the UK blood transfusion services, the MRC disbanded its blood transfusion research committee in July 1982. We can take that down, thank you. Professor Cash was a member of the DHSS's Expert Advisory Group on AIDS from 1985 to 1987. And he was a member of the UK Advisory Committee on Transfusion-Transmitted Diseases, which was set up in 1989. Again, if we look at the minutes of the first meeting of that committee, we'll get a flavour of its work. NHBT 5043_002, please, Shamik. So you'll see National Directorate of the NBTS UK Advisory Committee on Transfusion-Transmitted Diseases, and this was its first meeting, February 1989. We go to the next page. We'll see those present, and we see there Professor Cash identified, and indeed Dr. Gunson. You'll also see Dr. Contreras, and we'll be hearing oral evidence from Professor Contreras at a later stage. And then if we go a little further down, thank you, paragraph 2, second paragraph says, this present committee had been formed to discuss transfusion-transmitted diseases and to provide advice to the Departments of Health. And if we go on to page 5, we'll see the heading at point 7, non-A, non-B hepatitis. One of the issues being discussed by this committee in 1989 was the question of testing for non-A, non-B hepatitis. Again, that's a theme we'll come back to, not just this week, but on multiple occasions, I think, over the coming weeks. And you'll see there was a discussion in relation to ALT testing, with Professor Cash reporting at paragraph 7.3, and then 7.5, a discussion there about the screening or testing for hepatitis C, which, again, I'll be coming back to in some more detail. And Professor Cash attended the meetings of this committee on a regular basis. We've referred to on a number of occasions the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood. And if we look at NHBT 40/192_058, this is a letter from Dr. Gunson to Professor Cash, May 1991. If we look at the second paragraph of the letter, you'll see Dr. Gunson saying this: I well recall your efforts of a year or two ago to establish a ministerial group to control the introduction of additional donor testing. This led to the formation of the ACVSB, the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood. Professor Cash himself did not sit on that committee, but you'll see this letter suggests his actions were instrumental or played a part, at least, in its establishment. If we look, just sticking with this particular committee, if we look at another of Professor Cash's statements to the Penrose Inquiry, PRSE 302529, we'll see some observations in this statement that Professor Cash makes about both the ACVSB and the Advisory Committee on Transfusion-Transmitted Diseases. So if we pick it up on the bottom half of the page, the passage which is underlined, I was advised in 1991, and this may be, I think, a reference to the letter we've just looked at, that the ACVSB, the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood, had been conceived by DHSS officials partly in response to criticisms I had made of the way officials had managed the HIV/BTS interface. My concern in 1984-5 had been a lack of involvement of UK blood transfusion service professionals, a lack of urgency, an absence of transparency, and an uncertainty in my mind regarding accountability with respect to the Scottish Home and Health Department and Scottish ministers. The response of DHSS in 1989, the creation of the ACVSB, was, I recall, welcomed but proved not to be entirely satisfactory. This committee was again short of donation screening virology expertise. There was no mechanism for the SNBTS management team to have an input on the construction of the ACVSB agendas, submit briefing papers, or have access to meeting minutes. A strict code of secrecy supported by SHHD was imposed, so that on many occasions the SNBTS General Manager, the Medical and Scientific Director, and the CSAs, that's Common Services Agency, Ms. Scott referred to that yesterday, General Manager had no knowledge of what was going on. There was no evidence of any urgency with regard to the timely resolution of important operational issues. Finally, the role of Scottish ministers in the process seemed unclear. And then if we go over the page, he then turns to consider the Advisory Committee on Transfusion-Transmitted Diseases. The ACTTD was the brainchild of Dr. Gunson. Dr. Gunson believed it would assist him to take to the ACVSB the views of a wider group of UK BTS experts. He also wished to encourage the ACVSB academic virologists to dialogue with UK BTS virologists. This development enjoyed my full support, though in due course it generated serious problems for Dr. Gunson. On a number of occasions, considerable tension arose between the two committees. The academic virologists were at times uncomfortable working with some other members of the ACTTD. Senior DHSS officials became alarmed that they had no control of ACTTD and at one time took extraordinary action to prevent attempts to establish formal links between the two committees. Dr. Gunson was on occasions to find himself in a difficult position when he knew that the advice generated by the ACTTD would not be acceptable to DHSS. On one occasion, this led Dr. Gunson to offer his resignation as ACTTD chairman. The deliberations of the ACTTD also provided the first ever opportunity for some members of wider UK BTS management teams to scrutinise closely the operational differences between the blood transfusion services in England and Wales and Scotland. At times, this was a cause of some distress and unhappiness. And then if we just look a little further down to the next underlined answer, he was asked a question about how membership of the bodies were determined, and he says ACVSB members, were selected by DHSS after, I presume, consultation with other departments. ACTD members were selected by Dr. Gunson in consultation for SNBTS members with myself. So that's a flavour of Professor Cash's views on those committees. In terms of the reference to a degree of secrecy, we can see that issue teased out in correspondence between Professor Cash and David McIntosh of SNBTS. So if we look at PRSE 40615, this was a letter from Professor Cash to Mr. McIntosh, 29th of August 1991, in which he says, I've recently had access to minutes of the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood. And then he notes what's said in those minutes about the policy for a uniform starting date, and that's for hepatitis C testing of blood donations. That letter triggered an interesting response from David McIntosh at NHBT 5077_071, 30th of August 1991. He thanks Professor Cash for the letter and then says this, isn't it interesting that this, the first alleged record of a clear UK policy in this regard, should come to our hands indirectly, unofficially, and too late. And then if we skip down a couple of further paragraphs, he says, it will be of some considerable interest to see if we can stimulate more clarity about to whom the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood provides advice and what status that advice has, who is thereafter responsible for turning that advice or amended versions of it into actual policy with authority to instruct action and or inaction, and then thirdly, who is responsible for communicating relevant and authoritative instructions clearly and timelessly to the relevant punters at the coal face. And then if we go over the page, actually, no, I'm sorry. Could we just continue with where I left off in that previous section? It's probably easier to look at the whole letter. So Mr. McIntosh continues by saying, there is, for instance, as yet no sign whatever that UK health ministers' alleged collective endorsement of the idea of a uniform starting date, having failed to achieve any such thing, has even gone as far as achieving a mild admonishment of the culprit who broke ranks. That's a reference to Dr. Lloyd's introduction of hepatitis C testing earlier than the national date. And that's an issue I'll come back to. I remain uncomfortable, continues Mr. McIntosh, that we are all most probably in a potentially seriously compromised position with which Dr. Mehta's unpublished minutes do nothing to assist us. Dr. Mehta's was DHSS, I think Deputy Chief Medical Officer. I'll double check I'm right about that. And then he says, we are, however, as often before, thank goodness, now taking important steps to help ourselves. And then if we go over the page, pick it up in the second paragraph, as you know, it's my belief that thereafter, whatever policy decisions are ultimately taken about what developments are to be progressed and when, should be conveyed to us very formally and very clearly by the relevant authorities in the NHS in Scotland. Where we are and where we are not free to do our own thing should also be made clear. That way we shall all know exactly where we stand. Clearly, it may only be possible to achieve part of what I'm looking for here. A certain amount of inherent ambiguity will always be required by civil servants, partly to protect ministers and partly to protect themselves. I remain convinced, however, that we can do a lot better next time than we manage collectively UK-wide to achieve over HCV. And that the theme that arises from that letter, a theme of tension between Scotland and, on the one hand, and England and Wales, tension with the Scottish Home and Health Department, tension with the Department of Health, and indeed tension between the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service and the Blood Transfusion Service for England and Wales. Those are all themes which emerge at different times and in different ways, but nonetheless very clearly from a number of interactions that Professor Cash has or records. Then, if we go back to the question of committees that Professor Cash belonged to, he was a member also of the SNBTS and National Blood Transfusion Service Liaison Committee. If we go to NHBT 40189_173, we can see there, these are the minutes of the first meeting of the National Blood Transfusion Service / SNBTS Liaison Committee. So an attempt to have better communication, better dialogue between the Scottish and English and Welsh National Blood Transfusion Services. The first meeting was 27th of June 1990, and we'll see present Dr. Gunson, Professor Cash, Mr. McIntosh, whose letter I've just referred to, and R.J. Moore, and that I think is a reference to Roger Moore, who was Deputy Director, I think I'm right, Deputy Director of the National Blood Transfusion Service. And we can see 1.2 says communications between SNBTS and MBTS, whilst generally good, would be improved by more prior consultation on appropriate issues. Awareness of each other's activities should avoid needless duplication of effort. Other meetings which Professor Cash attended, he attended meetings of Scottish Regional Transfusion Directors. He was a member of the SNBTS Ethics Committee Clinical Research Investigation set up in 1984. He attended a number of meetings of the English and Welsh Regional Transfusion Directors as a representative of SNBTS. He attended some meetings between Regional Transfusion Directors and Haemophilia Centre Directors. If we look at DHSC 0002189_014, we'll see here he was a member of the working group on trends in the demand for blood products. This was their report, and paragraph 1 explains that this was a group established in January 1977 by the DHSS in consultation with the Scottish Home and Health Department and the Welsh Office. Decided it would help in planning the future development of blood transfusion services if the likely trends in the demands for blood and blood products were known. And then we can see the membership there set out. Number 1 is Dr. Cash, Director, Edinburgh and South East Scotland Blood Transfusion Service. Terms of reference of this particular working group at the bottom of the page to consider the likely trends in the demand for blood products over the next 5 to 10 years, taking into account the practicalities of supply. Then if we look at CBLA 40473, again, this is just to give a flavour of the range of committees that Professor Cash belonged to. This is described as an exploratory meeting of blood transfusion directors and haemophilia reference centre directors held in October 1976. The list of attendees is over the page. And I won't go through all the names, but I can assure you Dr. Cash is there on the right-hand side of the, about halfway down the list of attendees. And if we go back to the first page, we'll just get a flavour of the range of issues that were discussed and to which Professor Cash contributed. Paragraph 3 was a discussion of estimates for usage of freeze-dried factor VIII concentrates. Item 4 was about plasma supply, and Dr. Cash was recorded there as being someone contributing to that issue. And then reference made to making the case for increased funding. And then item 5 was raising questions about space, staff and equipment to deal with increased plasma supply. And paragraph 6, methods of distribution in England and Wales and in Scotland. So I should just say the vast majority of the documents I've just referred to, and indeed the documents we'll look at today and tomorrow, will refer to Scotland, they'll refer to England or to England and Wales. There is very little reference in the materials to Northern Ireland, and there is very little reference to attendance of Northern Ireland representatives. And that's not always the case, and we do see, and unlikely to explore it particularly this week, but we do see the relationship between the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Centre and the plasma being sent from Belfast to the PFC in Edinburgh. And we'll pick that up at future hearings when we'll be looking at the position in Northern Ireland. But it is quite a striking feature of the documents I've looked at that whilst we see a lot of discussion about the position in Scotland, the position in England, to some extent the position in England and Wales, Northern Ireland is rarely mentioned in the materials that we'll be looking at this week. Just to complete the picture in terms of committees, and this is not an exhaustive list, he attended other groups, organisations, working parties and so on, but Professor Cash was on the Medicine Inspectorate Ad Hoc Project Steering Group in 1982 to coordinate matters relating to the Medicines Inspectorate. He attended meetings of the Advisory Committee on the National Blood Transfusion Service as an observer from Scotland. He attended some meetings of the Scottish and Northern Ireland Coagulation Factor VIII Working Party and attended a liaison committee between NIBSC and the UK Blood Transfusion Service in 1987. Putting it colloquially, a finger in many pies in terms of developments in relation to blood and blood safety. Professor Cash also had the role of consultant advisor on blood transfusion to the Scottish Home and Health Department. So he was the equivalent in Scotland to Dr. Tovey and then Dr. Gunson in England. And he occupied that role from 1979 to 1986. If we look at PRSC 301514, we'll see the terms in which he stood down from that role. This is a letter, the 24th of March 1986, to the Scottish Home and Health Department. It's been my privilege to act as consultant advisor in blood transfusion to the Scottish Home and Health Department since 1979. I take the view that it is no longer appropriate for me to hold this formal position, which is attached to it a modest honorarium. I would therefore wish to resign as of the 1st of May 1986. There were a number of tensions between Professor Cash and the SHHD, which emerge when one looks at the contemporaneous documentation. We can get a flavour of that from PRSE 302563. This is a letter from Professor Cash, 18th of January 1986, so a couple of months before he stepped down from his role as consultant advisor, addressed to Dr. Archie McIntyre at the SHHD. And he says in the first paragraph, I write to express my grave concern at the way colleagues in SHHD have been put in a position and appear to have accepted this position in which they are prepared to challenge the professional competence of my senior scientific and medical staff. I refer to the matter of our plans to validate the safety of our heat treatment processes with respect to AIDS viruses. The good professional relationships we have enjoyed over many years with colleagues in SHHD are too precious a commodity to the SNBTS for me to do anything that would cause unnecessary harm. On the issue in question, therefore, I would wish only to conclude that we've agreed that the plan is not an overkill reaction, that it was never our intention to validate spiking experiments in patients, nor undertake spiking activity within the production facility at PFC. And then he says this, whilst I acknowledge that those of us who work within the public sector must accept the ultimate dominance of political, in speech marks, considerations, I would at this time make a plea that those of your colleagues who continue to express concern at spiking procedures being done in PFC come to PFC, look at the relevant facilities and discuss the problems with Dr. Perry and his staff. So a specific issue which gave rise to that letter, but a hint of a broader issue in terms of the relationship between SNBTS and SHHD. And if we look at yet another of Professor Cash's multiple statements to the Penrose inquiry, PRSE 304020. Professor Cash talks about the relationship between the SHHD and SNBTS, and indeed the relationship between SHHD and the DHSS in London. So this happens to be a response to a statement from David McIntosh, who was the general manager of the SNBTS. But if we look at the bottom half of the page, Professor Cash says this more broadly about the various relationships. There was never any doubt in my mind, after over a decade as the SNBTS's National Medical Director, that Scottish ministers and their officials were ultimately legally responsible for the work of the SNBTS. Indeed, this was well discussed in a meeting held in SHHD in September 1988. Then he says, that said, occasions arose when Scottish ministers and their officials deemed it appropriate, sometimes because of perceived limited resources, that DHSS took a lead position in the development of policy/strategy. I understood that this situation did not make the Scots in any way operationally subservient to the English, but I sensed that when DHSS had a lead position, SHHD was reluctant to challenge their advice, not least because DHSS seemed always to ensure that SHHD were in some way engaged in their policy/strategy developing process. And then top of the next page, he says, I was satisfied that in theory SHHD could at any time have gone its own way. And then he suggests and sets out various examples of there being a separate Scottish policy approach. Next paragraph, he talks about his own record for challenging events in England and Wales in defence of the SNBTS. Again, I'm not going to read all those aloud, but he sets out a number of issues there. And then if we go to the bottom of the page, we can then see concern about role of DHSS and SHHD's, as it were, a degree of subservience being described. So he says, there was never any doubt in my mind from my many discussions with Dr. McIntyre, SHHD, that both with the introduction of HIV and HCV donation screening, SHHD, so Scotland, had invited the DHSS to take the lead. Of course, I regret that these decisions were taken without consultation with the SNBTS management team or SHHD's consultant advisor for HIV on blood transfusion, and made these disappointments known to Dr. McIntyre. Had consultation taken place, then we would have almost certainly advised SHHD colleagues that both with regard to HIV and HCV, SNBTS had enough scientific expertise to generate sufficient quality data from which Scottish ministers could be appropriately informed. On both occasions, HIV and HCV, when I discussed this option with Dr. McIntyre, SHHD, it was clear that a policy decision had already been taken to devolve the lead to DHSS, and SHHD considered the separate engagement of SNBTS at this stage might be a distraction and a potential cause of difficulty. Just pausing there, in relation to the introduction of hepatitis C screening, what this appears to suggest is a desire on the part of Professor Cash for Scotland to formulate its own position rather than be led by the DHSS in England. That's not necessarily completely consistent with the contemporaneous documents, and when I come to hepatitis C screening, we'll see what Professor Cash's position recorded at the time was. But in any event, that's what he was saying in relation to the relationships between SNBTS, SHHD and the DHSS. If we just go over to the next page, in the bottom of the page, last paragraph is effectively an expression of regret at not having a more influential role for SNBTS. So he says this, I believed and still do that the safety of blood supplied by unpaid donors in a country such as ours is a national UK corporate and moral high priority, and within this, donation testing should be paramount, what I failed to do, both with HIV and HCV, despite considerable efforts, was to secure a place for the SNBTS to influence the management of the UK agenda for kit evaluation, and thereafter be engaged in discussions on implementation. As I say, I'll pick up some of the more concrete interventions of Professor Cash in relation to those issues, but particularly in relation to the introduction of hepatitis C screening in due course. Lastly, by way of introduction, if we go to SBTS 40187_047, this is a letter written by Professor Cash on the 11th of January 1990 to Mr. Hamill, the SHHD, and the context is the HIV haemophilia litigation. There are some specific observations Professor Cash makes in this letter, but I really draw attention to it for some of the overall themes. If we pick it up in the third paragraph, he says this. The lawyers have now advised that the PFC was originally briefed during its design phase, in the late 1960s, I presume, to fractionate plasma from Scotland and the north of England, Newcastle, Leeds, Sheffield, Manchester and Liverpool. I was a young senior registrar at the time, but do recall some heated conversations when the message came from SHHD, originating, I understood, from London, forget it, design only for Scotland. It's easy with hindsight, but there can be no doubt that this decision was a grave error of judgment, and I would advise that you delve into the archives and see whether there are records which at the very least ensure SHHD is all clear. I would advise that you look out for two other topics, and then he refers to the shift experiment at the Protein Fractionation Centre. It's been referred to so in earlier hearings. His recollection is, as set out here, that PFC had demonstrated they had very substantial spare fractionation capacity. And if we look at the last few lines on the page, he says it was assumed by those of us on the shop floor that this experiment would expedite arrangements to give England and Wales assistance, but nothing materialised. And then over the page, he records at the top of the page, aside from the England-Wales connection, PFC management are on record over many years of repeated requests for shift working facilities. It's my understanding and that of PFC management that SHHD consistently rejected these proposals. It's also the opinion of those of us involved in this succession of requests that the SHHD response on this issue was dictated by London, and that this in turn was influenced by the union ASTMS, which had a closed shop at BPL and was opposed to shift working. So I'm not proposing, so in the course of the presentation today or tomorrow, to go into the detail of the shift working experiment at all. It may be that, well, that's an issue that we pick up in the March hearings. And we've touched on it, I think, during the evidence of Dr. Diana Wolford. The purpose of showing you this letter now is just to provide a further example of what's said to be by Professor Cash, this perhaps uneasy relationship between SHHD and the DHSS in London. And then he continues in the next paragraph more broadly on that topic as follows. Finally, I think you should be aware that during the anticipated litigation, efforts will be made to demonstrate that there were serious defects in the operational liaison between SHHD and DHSS with regard to blood transfusion matters. I have to tell you that, in my view, this is a correct interpretation and is no better today than in late 1970 and throughout the 1980s. I attempted to persuade on numerous occasions both the CSA and SHHD that there was an urgent need for policy harmonisation and joint programmes of work. I even went and saw Mr. David Smart, previous chairman of CBLA, and pled with him to no avail. I persuaded Sir Simon Stevenson, chairman of CSA, to go down to visit Mr. Smart, and he subsequently declined to brief me on what transpired. In all these exercises, I had kept the relevant SHHD Undersecretary fully briefed, and on every occasion I was advised that the problem was in DHSS. And then he concludes as follows: I sense the ineptitudes of the past, to 1970s to 1980s, are about to catch up with us, and am of the opinion that this anticipated litigation should be settled out of court if possible. And then he goes on to say we should be looking to the future. And of course, it's important to bear in mind that this letter is January 1990, and there are still important decisions relating to the safety of the blood service still to be made, not least the introduction of hepatitis C screening and issues in relation to look back. And so he continues in this letter, we need also to be looking to the future, and then he refers to personnel within, I think, SHHD, and says, picking it up a few lines down, it will be our task to persuade him, that's the new figure in SHHD, to start building some north-south policy and operational bridges. I don't wish to launch once again into the EC problems ahead, but the challenges from Brussels makes the coming together of blood transfusion on some sort of UK basis imperative. Now, there are also a number of documents which talk about Professor Cash's perspective on the relationship between PFC and BPL, touched on in this letter, but not in any great detail. If we go to PRSE 302836, this is one of the statements to the Penrose inquiry. We've already looked at a passage in it relating to the MRC's disbandment of its Blood Transfusion Research Committee. If we turn now to page 4, we pick up Professor Cash's observations about relationships between BPL and PFC. So bottom of the page, at paragraph 10.2, picking it up 3 lines down, he says, on appointment as NMD, that's National Medical Director in 1979, I discovered that the relationship between Mr. Watt, Director of PFC, and his counterpart at BPL, Dr. Lane, was greatly strained. Before and after Mr. Watt left the SNBTS, December 1983, I made considerable efforts to repair the professional interface between SNBTS and BPL. Prior to Mr. Watt's departure, I attempted in 1980 to arrange a meeting between the PFC and BPL management teams with a view to exploring ways of getting the 8 concentrate production and associated research on a joint UK basis. BPL, go to the top of the next page, management refused to agree to such a meeting. I was later to learn this had the support of DHSS. And then he refers to the role of Dr. Smith. And then if we pick it up at the bottom of this page, please, goes into a little more detail. He was asked about a particular meeting in December 1982, which was a meeting with BPL. He says, there's no doubt that the meeting on the 15th of December 1982 at BPL was a very difficult one. As I recall, my difficulties were several. And then he elaborates upon the point he's already made. 2 years before this meeting, I had attempted to seek BPL's management support for a meeting which would explore the issue of a joint BPL-PFC approach to the manufacture and associated research of factor VIII concentrates for the whole of the UK. This proposition was rejected. No meeting took place, and by 1982, I had reason to believe, briefed by Dr. Harold Gunson, that DHSS had been party to this rejection and that SHHD, not known to me, were aware of this. I recall I took the view that as at December 1982, the efforts at bridge building had, before and after 1979, all come from the SNBTS and had been comprehensively rejected by BPL and DHSS. And then 12.2, he gives some further examples. on a number of occasions in 1980, 81, 82, I'd sought the support of SHHD officials to use their influence to ensure the Committee on Safety of Medicines explored what could be done to enhance the safety of commercial coagulation factor concentrates imported into the UK. These exhortations came to naught. By December 1982, I had reason to believe this proposition had also been blocked by DHSS, and this was known by BPL management. I was also concerned to discover that John Holgate, MCA, Joe Smith, NIBSC, seemed to be party to the proposition that UK clinical trials of commercial plasma products should be encouraged. And then he talks about the December 82 meeting in the next paragraph. As I recall, the main reason why we met at BPL on the 15th of December 1982 was for BPL and MCA/DHSS to ascertain whether the SNBTS would support the introduction of clinical trials on UK haemophilia patients of US-sourced commercial 8 concentrates that have been subject to some form of viral inactivation. I had the feeling throughout this meeting that a decision in favour of this development would somehow be an advantage to BPL and DHSS. I totally opposed this development, but later greatly regretted the way I conveyed my opposition. My initial problem was that I felt we'd been ambushed, was distressed to see Professor Arthur Bloom, an old friend, a mentor of Dr. Ludlam and the HCD in Cardiff, had been persuaded to chair the meeting. And then he refers to the reasons for his opposition to the proposal. I'm not going to go through all of it, but we can just, I think, perhaps get a flavour of it from paragraph, what's said to be paragraph 12.141. So this is his opposition to SNBTS involvement in clinical trials on early heat-treated commercial concentrates. And his reason here is by 82-83, there were a very limited number of haemophilia A patients in the UK that had not been exposed to commercial concentrates, so very few previously untreated with commercial concentrates. The highest percentage were in Scotland. This small group of patients, which included an even smaller subgroup, previously untransfused patients, PUPs, would be essential for the UK NHS fractionators when they wished, notwithstanding the disturbing issue of Crown immunity, to validate their viral inactivated products. If these patients were given away to US commercial interests, then NHS fractionators would be in serious difficulties. While Scotland had the highest percentage of patients which had not been exposed to commercial concentrates, in terms of total UK patients, the majority would be in England and Wales. It followed that we had intentions to seek access to some of the England and Wales patients for the SNBTS virus inactivated products, and in due course we did. And then if we just pick it up at paragraph 12.143, he talks about viewing the development in the UK as a sophisticated marketing exercise by US commercial fractionators rather than one directed to product safety. And he continues in a similar vein, talks about the issue in greater detail. I'm not going to take time now going through all of it, but it's a statement well worth reading and considering. Of course, more generally, in relation to Professor Cash's views about the National Blood Transfusion Service in England and Wales, Ms Scott referred you yesterday to Professor Cash's letter in the BMJ, in which he was heavily critical of the organisation, labelling it a fragmented and disorganised shambles. I'm not going to go back to that because you've looked at it only yesterday. The reference for the benefit of the transcript is PRSE 4059, I think it's 8, but I can't read my own handwriting. Yes, 598. It's right to note that there's a response by Dr. Gunson, and indeed a response by some others, to Professor Cash's article, perhaps unsurprisingly not agreeing with it. I think Ms Scott will take you to that during the presentation later this week on Dr. Gunson. Again, for the benefit of the transcript, the reference is WITN 2050047. I think that's right. Again, might be a handwriting issue there. And then, if we look at one other statement to the Penrose inquiry, PRSE 302223. the subject of this statement was Professor Cash's resignation as consultant advisor to the Scottish Home and Health Department in March 1986. And again, the purpose of looking at this is really because of what it reveals about the wider relationships, wider tensions. He says it might be helpful to the inquiry team, that's the Penrose inquiry, to know that March 1986 was the second time I offered my resignation as SHHD consultant advisor in blood transfusion. And then he details in the next paragraph the first occasion, which was in 1983. I'm not going to go through the detail of that, but if we look at the last paragraph on this page, it was essentially an industrial dispute. He describes the dispute ending abruptly when the SHHD withdrew from its position, but then says this in terms of the impact upon broader relationships. In my view, both at the time and thereafter, it was the cause of an almost complete disruption in professional relations between some important and senior members of SHHD's medical team and me, which I suspect lasted for more than a decade. I took the view in 1983 that my conduct in this industrial dispute may not have been appropriate for a consultant advisor to SHHD, that my professional relationship with the responsible Deputy Chief Medical Officer had been irreparably damaged, and that as we were about to address the consequences of HIV in our donor panels, I should offer to step down and allow SHHD colleagues to make a fresh start. Dr. Reid did not agree with this position and persuaded me to withdraw my resignation. So that was the position as at 1983. And then he talks in the next paragraph about his second and final resignation from the position in 1986. Sometime in the first weeks of March 1986, I requested a meeting with Hugh Morrison, SHHD Undersecretary with responsibility for the SNBTS. At this meeting, I listed a series of events which I believe demonstrated that the SNBTS was, to its detriment, increasingly being caught up in the politically controlled management chaos of the NBTS. I advised Hugh that I believed it was time for someone to stand up and speak out, and regrettably that had to be me. I further advised how I intended to do this by way of a publication in the British Medical Journal, and that is presumably a reference to the article that was subsequently published. And that as I intended to begin drafting this as soon as possible, I felt obliged to tender my resignation as consultant advisor to SHHD with immediate effect. And so that's, as it were, an introduction in terms of relationships, difficulties in relationships, and Professor Cash's perception of the roles in broad terms of the SHHD and of the DHSS. Of course, those are his views, and they may well be challenged by others. I'm just going to turn now to a discrete and separate topic, which sets out Professor Cash's views on issues relating to licensing and product liability. And again, it's a theme which emerges really on a number of occasions in Professor Cash's interactions and writings. We can perhaps pick it up in 1979 at DHSC 302367_003. So it's a regional transfusion directors meeting on the 27th of June 79. If we look at the bottom of this first page, we can see at the last paragraph, third line, that Dr. Cash was attending his first RTD meeting as the National Medical Director of SNBTS. And then if we go to page 7, there's a heading, Draft Consultative Paper on Product Liability. Directors were worried that they, as producers of blood products at the regional transfusion centres, could be held personally responsible if the product was eventually found to be defective. Mr. Wormold, that's a DHSS representative, pointed out that in some cases directors might be jointly responsible with the health authority if it was found, for example, that the blood had been handled incorrectly at the hospital. The question whether blood ought to be excluded from the scope of product liability still had to be debated. There might be a defensible case for treating blood differently from pharmaceuticals, but so far the case had not been made. And then Dr. Cash's contribution Dr. Cash thought it was difficult to discuss product liability until the department decided whether the National Blood Transfusion Service should be covered by Crown privilege. And if there was to be no Crown privilege, then the government would have to provide financial support in the event of a mishap leading to liability. And the issue of Crown privilege was one, or Crown immunity was one which Professor Cash returned to on a number of occasions over the years that followed. I'm only going to give you a flavour of that because there are quite a lot of documents. PRSC 303850. So this moves forward now a number of years. This is February 1987. And it's a letter from Professor Cash to Mr. Donald at the Common Services Agency. The subject is product licences. He picks up, he refers to a meeting at SHD in the first paragraph. Then in the second paragraph, explains that the boards and presumably the CSA, he'd been advised several years ago that there was no requirement for SHS, manufacturers of pharmaceuticals, to obtain product licences. The reason for this was the privilege of Crown immunity. And then, if we go 2 paragraphs further down, we see Professor Cash saying, I strongly advise that you arrange an urgent meeting with Mr. Hugh Morrison with a view to getting the matter clarified. That's the question of whether product licences were required. And then he makes a number of observations. First, there are 15 haemophilia A patients in Edinburgh who have been unequivocally infected with HIV from PFC product, which we believe is licensed. Thus, we presume no Crown immunity. You'll be aware of the pending legal actions with regard to the Glasgow patients. 2, we have several products we believe are fully licensed. Is it the agency desire that we immediately seek to revoke these licences? 3, is it the agency desire that all work currently going on to licensed PFC products should stop? We plan to amend our Factor 8 licence for Z8 early in April. So we see the issue there being raised in the context of potential litigation from HIV infection. There's then various subsequent letters and other documents in which it's said that Professor Cash was wrong to believe that holding a product licence or applying for a product licence would affect Crown immunity. We've set out some of the details in our written presentation. I'm not going to go through all of them. If we look next at it's PRSC 40712. So it was an issue which seemed to give rise to a number of discussions throughout the course of 1987. So there's a Scottish Health Service Common Services Agency memo. There's a meeting in October 1987 in which Professor Cash attends, in which the issue is discussed. And then we pick it up with another letter from, this is from Dr. Perry, but copied to Professor Cash, December 1987, in which we see the anxiety being expressed, really from the heading on the letter, product liability / personal liability, and the concern which Professor Cash shared, recorded towards the end of that first paragraph, was that those involved with SMBTS or the PFC were exposed and vulnerable in an area of product manufacture which attracts considerable public attention. And then there was a response from the Common Services Agency to the effect that this was a red herring. There was, which then resulted in Professor Cash writing at PRSC 40462 in the following terms, and I'm not going to go into the full detail of the extent to which this issue was resolved, but I just want to get a sense of what Professor Cash thought as at July 88 on it. These are his views about the PFC, second paragraph, second line. It's my professional view that the PFC has and is operating out with the standards of the pharmaceutical industry. The evidence for this can be summarised as follows. PFC has manufactured product which has unequivocally endangered the lives of patients, and he gives reference to 2 recorded occasions of that. Paragraph 2, there have been a number of occasions when I've been called upon to authorise the issue of products which fail to meet specifications. I have on many occasions since 1979 given authorisation in order to keep supplies in place for the SHS, that's Scottish Health Service. 3, unlike our sister commercial organisations, we've received no instruction to clear all batches of PFC products with the National Institute of Biological Standards and Control before we issue for clinical use. 4, notwithstanding the awaited formal report of HM Medicines inspectors, both Bob Perry and myself were party to a conversation which clearly indicated that on the basis of breaches of GMP, that's good manufacturing practice, PFC's continued function rested on the provision of Crown immunity. And in his 5th point, important for us to remember that the provision of a product licence in the pharmaceutical industry will only take place if the manufacturer has a manufacturing licence. This does not seem to have applied to PFC.
Just going back to the previous page for a moment, what is said at the bottom of paragraph 4, on the basis of breaches of good manufacturing practice, PFC's continued function rested in the provision of Crown immunity. That's looking, I think, to the future. It's paragraph 1 looks to the past.
Yes.
And there he says in an interesting expression in relation to the 2 recorded occasions when it would seem that products produced at the PFC had led to the transmission. I think what is said is intended here of HIV to patients. His view is that breaches of good manufacturing practice could not be ruled out.
Yes, that's right. And this, I'm really just alighting on a handful of documents here which show particularly strong expressions of view by Professor Cash. We'll want to return to the issue more thematically and look at it in a little greater detail, not exhaustively, in March when we look at PFC and BPL, and we'll no doubt wish to explore a little the issues of Crown immunity as they did or did not apply to those organisations.
I mean, I appreciate what you're taking me to here is his views on Crown immunity, and what I was raising with you was really a comment on evidential,
yes,
of evidential value in another context, which
absolutely
is the question of whether there was something wrong with the product, and it has to be noted for anyone who's following this and thinks that it is necessarily to be understood that Mr. Cash was saying that was why they transmitted HIV. He doesn't actually draw any causative link directly.
No, he doesn't in this letter. The earlier letter we looked at, the 1987 letter, is the one which uses that term of patients having been unequivocally infected with HIV from PFC products in circumstances where he believed there was no Crown immunity.
Yes.
But
he's not saying that the good manufacturing practice led to that necessarily.
Not necessarily, no. Again, issues of compliance with good manufacturing practice was, again, something of a matter of concern for Professor Cash over a number of years. And that is, I'm sure, an issue that we'll explore with the PFC evidence in March. So I want to turn next to Professor Cash's views on issues relating to self-sufficiency and plasma supply. I'm going to start with an interview Professor Cash gave in 19 90. That interview encompasses a broader range of issues, and to avoid the need to go back to it, what I propose to do is look at the interview in full, the transcript of the interview in full, and then that'll be probably the appropriate moment for a morning break, and then I can return to some of the more specific details about self-sufficiency and plasma supply. So if we look at SBTS 5053_055, this is described as edited notes of interview with Professor John D. Cash, Medical and Scientific Director of Scottish Blood Transfusion Service, Edinburgh, 30th of May 1990. So we have the date of the interview. We're told the notes are edited notes. If we go to the last page, the signature's been redacted, but it is the signature of Dr. Cash, so it would appear that he had approved this document and the contents of it. He signs it and dates it the 29th of November 1990. It's not clear who's taken the notes or who the interview is with, but as we'll see when we look at the transcript or the notes, it refers to a conversation that Professor Cash had with Graham Ross. So it looks as though this is an interview taking place with Professor Cash for the purposes of and in the context of the HIV haemophilia litigation. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there are some interesting and important opinions expressed by Professor Cash. So if we go to the bottom of this first page, he's asked about an article in the BMJ in September 1976. I'm going to look at that article later in the presentation. It's an article co-authored by Professor Cash and Mary Spensley. For the benefit of the transcript and those following, the reference for that BMJ article, although we don't need to turn to it now, is PRSE 303425. And then the question is, at the bottom of the page, in that article, you drew attention to the respective benefits and disadvantages attaching to the three then methods of treating haemophilia, which were first fresh frozen plasma, second cryo, and third AHF, anti-haemophilic factor. Is it accurate to use AHF as another term for what I call factor VIII concentrate? Over the page, yes. And then the question is put by reference to the article that the paper was saying was that there were advantages of concentrate over cryo. The answer then given by Professor Cash's cryoprecipitate was very unpopular with some patients for some of the reasons you've given, but also for the higher incidence of allergic reactions when compared to AHF. Then there's an exploration of what might be said to be the advantages of cryoprecipitate. And then the question is put, insofar as there was an argument to be made for cryo in 1976, it was essentially a logistic argument and a financial argument. Is that a fair summary? And then this was Professor Cash's answer, yes. But one of the main burdens of the paper was to suggest that we should not abandon cryoprecipitate until we were certain we have enough plasma to withstand the anticipated drop in yield for what clearly is a better product. If we moved in an unplanned way from cryo to AHF, it might mean we would have to buy factor VIII from commercial companies. Question, and that was the worry? Answer, yes. Question, was the worry directed at economics or safety or a combination of both? Answer, for us, safety was paramount. We wished to minimise exposure of patients to commercial concentrates. Question, does the article bring that out? Next page. Probably not as clearly as it could, although I should say we were writing against the background of the World Health Organization recommendations of 1975. This is a very important document which I suggest you read, and then he sets out the WHO declaration, and then continues. The article to which you refer picks up from that point and attempts to address some of the consequences of these WHO recommendations in the context of factor VIII concentrate. Question, what was the reaction from within the profession to that article? Answer, I cannot honestly say. As far as I'm aware, virtually zero, at least outside the Scottish Health Service. Question, a voice in the wilderness. Answer, perhaps, but at that time there wasn't a satisfactory forum in which a corporate reaction could be generated. And then the question is put about self-sufficiency in Scotland. Was Scotland self-sufficient in AHF? Answer, no. One of the reasons I wrote the article was to galvanise my colleagues in Scotland to take advantage of the major investment the Scottish office had made in building a new fractionation centre which was opened in 1975. It was built on the basis that we are going to go for self-sufficiency. The published paper was in fact part of an invited lecture I delivered to an international meeting in Helsinki some months before. So in a sense, at a local level, the BMJ article was a clarion call, let's go. Then there's a discussion of the date of opening of the PFC and where the funding came from. We go towards the bottom of the page. The last question is, so Scotland had accepted the concept of self-sufficiency many years earlier. That's a reference to the fact that the planning for the PFC had begun in the late 60s. Answer, yes, I conclude that it had. However, I should point out that I was not a director at that time and thus was not a party, over the page, to these discussions, and certainly cannot take any credit. Moreover, it was never, as far as I can remember, expressed in those terms. It was always assumed in Scotland, ever since I joined the service in 62-3, that our job was to provide all blood and blood products required for Scotland. The concept of self-sufficiency more clearly emerged in 1975 against the background of the WHO report. My personal interpretation of self-sufficiency from the WHO recommendations was that we must develop a programme which led us to advise the commercial providers of plasma products that they were no longer required. Such sentiments, of course, have political connotations, and in those days, one sense, we didn't have overt Scottish Office support for the concept of commercial companies go home, but we did sense strong Scottish Office support for the idea that we should get going and make as much as the Scottish Health Service patients needed. The question then, it would take some time for the fractionation centre to get into full production. By what date was the fractionation centre able to meet all of Scotland's demands for self-sufficiency? Answer, sometime in 83-84. It wasn't the fractionation centre that was rate limiting, it was the availability of plasma. In fact, we didn't have any firm policy decisions in Scotland until we'd completed a major planning review in 1979, from which emerged our incremental targets up to the year 2006. Question, insofar as you were not self-sufficient between 1975 and 1983, where were you buying your commercial factor VIII concentrate? Answer, yes, but this purchasing exercise was, as in England and Wales, the responsibility of local health authorities, haemophiliac centres, hospital pharmacists, etc. We, the SNBTS, were not directly involved. Answer, question, would you know where they bought from? Answer, they would buy from the identical sources as our friends in England and Wales, primarily the USA, because to the best of my knowledge, this was the primary source in those days. And then you see a reference to the conversation with Ross. That's Graham Ross.
If this is an interview with Graham Ross...
It's not, no. It refers to an interview with Graham Ross.
I see.
It's clear it's not itself being conducted by Mr. Ross, because the questions would have been phrased differently. But whoever is conducting it has a note of Graham Ross's discussion, which is what leads me to think it was probably an interview with solicitors during the course of the HIV haemophilia litigation. And we can pick that up. The top of page 6, please. Question, can I read to you part of Graham Ross's note arising out of your telephone conversation with him on the 28th of November 1989 and ask you to say whether or not it accurately reflects your views? And then the quote is, appointed medical director of SBTS 1979. At no time during the period he held that position did he make any offer to Elstree to process English or Welsh plasma, nor was he involved to his knowledge in any discussions on that matter. And then the question is posed, is that right? Answer, yes and no. As we began to develop our own self-sufficiency programme in Scotland sometime in the early 1980s, it became clear to us that our friends south of the border were in serious difficulties. And this had arisen because they had accepted that their laboratory at Elstree would be inspected. We understood it had been inspected and found to be in some difficulty. It became clear to us that if we operated our facility 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so this returns to the shift work at PFC, we could take some pressure off our friends in England, There will be two requirements. First, a modest expenditure on increased accommodation for what we call finishing. Secondly, we required permission from the government to allow us to introduce a shift working system. We've been anxious to introduce such a system since our centre had been commissioned in 1975 because the technology we'd installed was quite unique. It had been designed to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with a computer looking after it. And then he provides a little more detail about that. And then the last sentence of the paragraph on the screen, my predecessors had been very distressed when the final message came through that we would not be required to fractionate for the north of England, but for Scotland only. So that's going back to the earlier period in the 70s. And then he says, I can well remember the resultant disappointment of my then senior colleagues because it was thought sensible to have two major fractionation centres in the UK, primarily for strategic supply reasons and coordinated research and development. My predecessors decided they would not change the engineering system as such, so that potential capacity remained in place, but all the associated downstream facilities, packaging, etc., were scaled down very substantially. When we came to the 1980s and we're looking at our own plans for self-sufficiency, and as our staff had gained confidence in running the CVSM system, we were keen to introduce a shift system. One way we thought we could get it was to offer our English friends some help because at that time they were in some difficulty. We did not offer to sell products. We hadn't enough plasma in 1981 for Scotland. What we offered was our fractionation capacity. I don't think we should delude ourselves that if it had come to pass, it would have solved all the problems in England and Wales. Moreover, we didn't do the final sums, and at least initially the assistance would have been directed towards albumin production only. We communicated our thinking to our employing authority, the Common Services Agency in Scotland. I was not, as far as I can recall, involved in direct communications with Elstree. And then he's asked, we're talking about 1981, yes, 1980-81. To the best of my knowledge, our employing authority reported this to the Scottish office and they reported it to the DHSS in London. I do not recall receiving any other response than one which suggested our albumin was below the standard required in England and Wales. And then he refers to a parliamentary commission visiting PFC. Further down, we pick it up with the paragraph saying, we assumed at the time, but nothing was said, that this visit indicated that the union was deeply concerned that there might be a movement of English plasma to Scotland into an environment which was not a closed shop. We assumed there was also understandable anxiety about jobs at Elstree, and local union leaders had contacted the ASTMS-sponsored MPs, requesting them to advise the Minister not to accept the Scottish offer. This is all assumption. All I can tell you is they came, they were very courteous, they had afternoon tea and went, but we got no subsequent feedback. Of course, I should say, and again, although we haven't explored this issue fully by any stretch of the imagination so far, and we'll come back to it in March, but we've seen some of the DHSS materials which suggest perhaps a different way of thinking and issues of the costs that might be involved playing some part in the decision-making. And then the question is, did you try to take it up again with your employing authority? Yes, on several occasions, but as I recall, they had had no clear response other than the comment made about the quality of the albumin product we produced, although this product has since been used in England on many occasions without ill effect. The issue seemed to simply run into the sand, and for whatever reasons, we got the distinct impression there was no enthusiasm from those colleagues responsible south of the border. And then a question is asked a couple of paragraphs further down. If the English authorities had taken up your offer to initiate a 24-hour shift working, would you have needed a corresponding increase in your finishing facilities? Answer, yes. And then if we go to the next page, there's then a discussion. I'm not going to go through it in full detail, but there's a discussion in the first paragraph from Professor Cash about Crown immunity and the Medicines Inspectorate not having gone into Elstree until a point in time. And then he says this, that's the SMBTS PFC, on the other hand, had always taken a different view. Despite having Crown immunity, we'd welcomed the Inspectorate on the grounds that we would learn an immense amount about good manufacturing practice. There's then the discussion turns to Dr. David Owen's announcement of the £500,000 towards the concept of self-sufficiency. And if we go towards the bottom of the page, you'll see about 4 lines up from the bottom, the view of Professor Cash, the managerial infrastructure that could respond to Dr. Owen's proposed investment was not in place in England. It's obviously just Professor Cash's opinion, but that is his recorded opinion here. The question is a total lack of meaningful infrastructure. Answer, yes. And then if we just go over the page, a couple of final passages in this. The second paragraph down is a question about importing American concentrates. And what's said is this: it's been said to us by virologists that this was dirty blood, a sewer of viruses. Was that a perception, I think that must mean perception, of American concentrate in the Scottish transfusion service over that period? Yes, but this description is... Oh.
I think it's telling us that maybe...
Time for a break.
Maybe
I'm
time for a break.
very nearly finished. I promise tea and coffee will come soon. So the answer is, I think we would simply say that if you use paid donors as your source material and you are operating in any community in which that payment is important to the donor, then when you come to ask serious questions about the donor's health and habits, the payment is an incentive to lie. This sort of incentive does not apply to the voluntary unpaid donor. This danger was clearly seen by the World Health Organization in 1975 in the context of the transmission of viruses in large pool plasma products. Then he talks about hepatitis in the next paragraph, concluding with this observation: even in America today, if you compare the unpaid versus the paid, it is still higher, and this also applies to HIV and HCV detection. And then next page, towards the bottom of the notes, the question is put in these terms: it's been suggested that blood originating in most third world countries or from paid donors is always at higher risk of transmitting viral infection, no matter what the nature of the screening process. Is that something you would agree with or not? Answer, yes. And this risk had long been recognised. Answer, yes. There, Professor Cash's views recorded in 1990, touching on both issues of risk and on matters of self-sufficiency in both Scotland and England. And with apologies to everyone for depriving them of their tea and coffee for 10 minutes, perhaps we could take the break now.
Well, we'll take a break then until 5 minutes to 12. 5 minutes to 12.